I'm Emily Jashinsky.
I'm Josh Hammer.
I'm Rachel Bovard.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. We have a really interesting episode of the show today. We're going to be talking about the intersectional CIA, which is always a fun topic. We're talking about all of the drama that's unfolding at Basecamp. We're talking about a Republican Party that's built for the people, and we're talking about efforts in Virginia to dumb down math curriculum in the dubious name of equity. So with that, let's dive right on into what the heck is going on at the CIA. Ben, tell us about the new video they debuted.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. The Wall Street Journal several months back sort of clued the American people into the fact that the CIA was trying to appeal to future millennial employees. And maybe that's a disastrous decision that they're making, because it appears the way that they're trying to cater to millennials is through identity politics and Wokism, which, as we've covered here at length, has really been pervading every aspect of our government, including the ones that can least afford to be pervaded by Wokism and political correctness in general, namely our national security, intelligence, and law enforcement apparatuses. So we've talked about this when it comes to the Department of Defense, but the intelligence community has crossed a new Rubicon, it seems. They've put forth a series of videos that I believe they're calling Humans of CIA. And one of these videos features this woman who describes herself as cisgender, talks about, and I'm paraphrasing, fighting the patriarchy, speaks about her, that she is intersectional, and basically goes through the whole milieu of sort of buzzwords that characterize our new woke America in this anti-cultural revolutionary era. And the interesting thing is, the whole focus of the video is essentially how this woman has been empowered by the CIA as a Latina immigrant. She uses the word mija, and she features this shirt which says mija on it as well. So this is all about essentially flying all of the identity flag colors, in effect, not the mission of the CIA, namely to steal secrets from our worst adversaries and protect our secrets from our worst adversaries. And the interesting thing is, if you actually click through the CIA's YouTube channel, you see that there are a series of videos akin to this. There's one that features a gay nose ring wearing librarian in the Central Intelligence Agency, and he actually commends John Brennan for wearing a rainbow colored lanyard during his ceremony where he was introduced to the CIA. There's another woman who is disabled. She's pictured wearing a shirt that says "Love is love," and she speaks about that she's so grateful that the CIA gave her a position originally as a receptionist. There are other individuals as well, sort of covering every single part of the spectrum if you're looking at the identity politics rainbow. But again, it's all to the exclusion of the mission of the CIA. And while there is lip service paid in sort of boilerplate to the fact that all of these people care about the mission of defending the United States, and that many of them were drawn to CIA as a consequence of 9/11, identity politics is front and center. And there are two ways to perceive this. The Glenn Greenwalds of the world, for example, have argued that just like woke capital embraces the social justice causes essentially to buy absolution from their capitalist sins, there's a portrayal by Glenn Greenwald and some others as well that the CIA, which for several years, for example, has talked about its devotion to diversity and inclusion, and put up, a picture of the CIA rainbow colored to celebrate the LGBTQ community, that it's really all just a smokescreen to cover for the CIA's really unsavory acts, and to try to show that they're moral and virtuous and just, when in reality they do all sorts of horrible things around the world. I take the perspective, on the other hand, that if you look at John Brennan's CIA, and he led the CIA as a hyper-political figure, and we saw that politicization blend into essentially our political system and lead to the targeting of political adversaries. No, you're seeing that the CIA truly is becoming ideological. And you can't separate the fact that the CIA is putting forth this woke vision from the policies that it's ultimately going to implement and the activities that it's going to undertake. And this takes on all the more heightened level of concern when you're talking about a Biden administration that is talking about pursuing what we've characterized here as a potential war on wrong thinkers. So given all that, I want to toss it over to the group and say, what do you make of the CIA putting out these videos? What do you think the implications are for our national security in the face of adversaries who are not constrained by pieties to political correctness and wokeism? And ultimately, do you believe that we are going to see a hyper-politicized CIA in perpetuity? I'll toss it out to anyone who wants to take any of those questions.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that I'll quickly add right at the top is it's not just the intelligence community that this is happening to. It's the U.S. military itself, something that I believe we've covered on previous podcast episodes. I mean, the U.S. Navy, I think it was the Navy, not a different branch. I'm sure they're all doing it, but it was at least the U.S. Navy that put out some like new recommended reading list that had like Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility or something like that. Over the weekend, at least in my social conservative friend circles, this tweet went viral. This tweet was from Travis Akers. History was made on Friday with the first ever all-gay U.S. Navy helicopter crew. And there's photos of the four men in the helicopter crew with a pride rainbow flag. Look, we're not going to talk about the underlying substance, obviously, of same-sex marriage or anything like that. But the point is here, when this is just such over-the-top aggressive virtue signaling that is afflicting all of America's purportedly top-tier institutions, these institutions that are sworn to protect us, to defend us against enemies, foreign and domestic. And, look, if there is one lesson, there's a lot of lessons that conservatives, Republicans, and so forth should have learned from the Trump years. But I think among the top of the list, and certainly Angelo Codavilla has written about this probably more than anyone else, is how the intelligence community, which I think back in the day was kind of it was a soft spot. Republicans had a soft spot for the intelligence community because it was like, it was badass. It was kind of inherently cool or something like that. There was like a nostalgic kind of suave factor affiliated with the CIA and America's top spies. But the repeated intensive politicization that we saw of the intelligence community during the 4 years of the Trump administration should have sobered, I think, any conservatives of that kind of misbegotten nostalgia. And all of this just aggressively woke stuff, whether it's in the CIA, the Navy, or any of these kind of military intelligence branches. I mean, what do our enemies think of this? I mean, like, what is Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, like, when they see this, what are they thinking to themselves? They're probably thinking to ourselves that, I mean, Xi sees this and he's definitely more incentivized to invade Taiwan tomorrow, right? I mean, it's just horrible. It's just horrible in every respect.
Well, I think that's exactly the point, right? The people benefiting from this the most are China, are Russia, are sort of our geopolitical adversaries. I talk about this a lot, but like our business community and sadly, I think our military and intelligence agencies have gone from prioritizing being the very best at what they do, whether it's making a product, whether it's defending America, to how performative can I be? How much can I sort of lay down in front of whatever the passing fad is, so nobody hurts me, right? So I'm, to Ben's point, so I can mask all of the other things I might be held accountable for doing. And this is especially true. I think Glenn Greenwald's point is well made about the CIA, who has acted without accountability on a number of fronts, including sort of being weaponized as a political tool. But this also goes to Google. I think about the race that we are in with China with artificial intelligence, right? Whoever grasps hold of AI and gets all of that work done the best and the fastest will have sort of global hegemony in this key area. And Google, purportedly our best hope of winning this race, they're embroiled in this struggle session about exactly these topics, about diversity, about ideology, about all of these things, instead of focusing on actually winning the AI battle. And so it's a question, for us nationally. We're going to become less competitive. We're going to lose our edge, I think, in our intelligence and military capabilities if this is what we focus on. Now, diversity as a good, right, is something that people can do. But when it becomes the highest good, when it takes the place of mission focus, of product focus, I think you start to lose a significant portion of what you're actually there to do. So.
Yeah, I can jump in. What I was going to say is exactly that. I mean, how many resources are being sucked into this ridiculous effort by the CIA that would be better allocated elsewhere. It reminds me of the Bill Maher segment that I think we discussed about a month ago, where he was talking about Dr. Seuss and the sort of leftist kerfuffle over Dr. Seuss, leftist instigated kerfuffle over Dr. Seuss. And he said, you know who's not worried about outdated Chinese stereotypes in these Dr. Seuss books? The Chinese. Like, they're building up their military and they're building up technology and doing all of these various things that could undercut us eventually, and are in fact explicitly and intentionally designed to undercut our power, while we sort of wax, woke about outdated cartoons. I mean, it is such a feature of our decadence, and it is such a distraction. It's so wildly unnecessary. And again, the last point I'll make is just that it is the entrenched power using identity politics to enhance their power. They are using this shield of identity politics to virtue signal and score points within their echo chamber, but also to silence and shut up by the public and any critics by further giving power to these new norms of what is acceptable speech, what isn't acceptable speech, what enlightenment actually looks like, what decency actually looks like, what anti-racism actually looks like, and giving credence to these ridiculous new standards of those important definitions. And the effect it has is disempowering critics, disempowering people who rely on their paychecks, and are thus victims of the chilled climate of speech. So it's complete and total nonsense, but I think it's also important to see how they're using this totally false premise of identity politics to enhance their own power at the end of the day.
Just briefly, I just want to add, in addition to juxtaposing CIA's wokeism versus the non-wokeism or unwokeism of our worst adversaries who are likely laughing at the CIA, it's also worth noting that as we've seen this increasing political correctness within the intelligence world, we've also seen a raft of failures. America constantly finds itself flat-footed about the military advances, technological advances, the capabilities of our worst adversaries. And that includes the Chinese, the Iranians, the Russians, and others as well. So at what cost? I think that point about resource allocation is pretty darn important. And then the last point I'll make is it pays to look back at the OSS, which preceded the CIA and had a bunch of colorful oddball characters from all sorts of backgrounds, because the whole purpose of the OSS was we need the smartest, most dynamic, creative people we can find who love this country to ultimately defeat our adversaries. And it doesn't matter what your background is, but now the background appears to be everything. And when that politics trumps merit, we all lose when it comes to our national security.
With that, Rachel, can you break down exactly what's happening at Basecamp, another American corporation that is mired in these fights about identity politics and frankly seems to not want to be mired in it anymore?
Yeah, what's happening at Basecamp, which you all may be familiar with, but it's a software company, that makes workplace management software, is almost perhaps, I hope, maybe the logical conclusion of when, your woke signaling and diversity and inclusion initiatives sort of take over and become the point of your company. So Basecamp, recently, its two founders, Jason Fried and David Heinemeier Hansson, released two blog posts that basically said, look, I'm gonna start with Jason Fried's first. He basically said, you know what, we're not gonna do politics at work anymore. We're gonna take a step back from excessive discussions of politics on our internal channels, from all of the committees that we have. We're even gonna reconsider, what we fund outside of work, because really it's none of our business what you do outside of work. I'm going through the blog post he pointed to, or that he put out, and I think point 6 is really instructive for what is happening at Basecamp. I'm gonna quote from it. He says, quote, "We make project management, team communication, and email software. We are not a social impact company." End quote. So you almost see Basecamp having to restate the fact that it is a software company. It is not, a woke signaling struggle session, that happens from 9 to 5. Followed up with a post from the other co-founder, David Heinemeier Hansson, which, because there was backlash within the company, and he clarified to say, look, and I'm going to quote from his post, quote, "We also encourage you to exercise your right to activism and political engagement outside of work. It's none of Basecamp's business how or whether you choose to spend your time, money, voice to support charities, causes, or political action groups," end quote. He also says the company is going to continue to engage in politics that directly relate to their business. So by that, I assume he means, political decisions being made on Capitol Hill as it relates to, how Basecamp is able to engage. So Basecamp was very clear here. They were like, look, politics has a place. We don't care what it is that you do outside of work, but when you show up to work, you have to actually focus on the business at hand, which is developing software, not engaging in sort of these woke struggle sessions. And I find it somewhat encouraging in a sense that I think it's almost when, woke politics reaches a threshold in the workplace, it actually does diminish productivity. It actually does hurt company morale. And if you spend some time in the post put out by Jason Fried, it becomes clear that that's kind of what he's getting at. It seems like the companies had spent a lot of time in these sort of, internal chains berating each other for politics, or, forcing people to, avow or disavow certain political beliefs. And that's not helpful, I think, to a company that's trying to actually, produce a product that has to be good. And so the Twitter backlash against this company was intense. And they even noted in the blog post how upset and angry everyone was. The sort of Google funded tech press went after these companies, which are their competitors, by the way. But what's interesting to me is that a third, so Basecamp, not unlike Coinbase, the crypto company a couple of months ago, who also said, we're not going to do politics work. If this bothers you, we will generously offer you a severance if you would like to leave, because we are not going to engage in performative politics at work. Basecamp offered the same thing. They offered up to 6 months severance, and a third of the company's employees took that severance. And, then went on to dramatically explode on Twitter and, talk about how offended they were and how, they were martyring themselves on behalf of ideology. And I think, my final point in observing all of it is this: wokeness in many cases, I think, is an argument made from a place of incredible privilege. Because these companies are leaving, or these employees are leaving a job. They are quitting a job, not because of any mistreatment, but because the company has decided they're going to prioritize their product over any kind of ideological discussion at work. The ability for them to performatively quit their job and then bank 6 months of severance and claim to be a martyr for that reason is it's an argument of incredible privilege. So I am encouraged a little bit to see these actions from companies like Basecamp. I'm curious to see how they respond in the short term. I think, they've lost some significant employees, so they may take a hit in the short term, but I'm wondering if overall, long term, this will actually benefit the company's bottom line.
Well, I think the best case scenario here is that what we've been living through is this very painful period of adjustment. And we could actually adjust in a better direction, because the companies right now are in these bubbles where they're terrified of the PR backlash that social media mobs can stoke. And they're terrified of their woke millennial employees who necessarily categorize them as bigots if they disagree. So they're just everyone was sort of easily bowled over and let this concept of, they call it stakeholder capitalism, and that's sort of what the Jamie Dimon model and what everyone at the Business Roundtable has sort of shifted towards, and with full-throated endorsements, by the way. That's sort of what Basecamp is rejecting, this notion that the company exists not primarily to create software and facilitate the use of software. It exists to be a social good. And that's interesting in this new era of wokeism, because that has implications for how we treat other people, how we treat customers, et cetera, because, you can sort of be a free market person and also say corporations' primary goal is to create their product and sell their product and serve their customers, without saying that involves, you can kind of disentangle that from politics and still say that you're serving the stakeholder and the customer. But that's sort of been distorted by the left in a really interesting way, and co-opted by people like Jamie Dimon and the business community. And that's kind of what Basecamp is rejecting here at its core, if you really peel back the layers. And it's interesting because, again, when it went too far, when the pendulum swung too far in the direction of wokeness, it is obviously hurting companies' productivity. It's like the university system that is dedicating so many resources and getting more and more bloated because it has to direct all these resources to Title IX departments and all of these silly features of the new campuses that are wildly unnecessary. That's happening in the business world too. They are devoting unnecessary resources to these things. They are clouding their mission and hurting their productivity. And so as companies start to see that, perhaps what we've been living through is an adjustment process and things will recalibrate and other people will follow Basecamp's model. And so I think that's maybe the optimistic way to interpret what is happening at Basecamp. It gives sort of other companies the comfort and the perspective to say, we can do this, like we can reclaim our productivity and we can just everyone take a break from bickering about Latinx at work. So we'll see if everybody else follows suit.
So I really like Emily's optimistic approach to this. Just kind of personalize it a little bit. I think back to my first job after law school. So I worked at a big kind of corporate white shoe law firm in Houston, Texas. And at the time I was lawyering by day, kind of like politically blogging and tweeting by night. So it's totally unsustainable, but I knew I didn't want to be a law firm partner or whatever. And I remember one time I at the water cooler, I was chatting with a really nice guy. He was kind of an older partner there, not too old, but older than I was. And he started asking me about like my views on something that I had written about. And I was like, well, I kind of try to keep like my private life is separate from my work life. And he goes, oh, private life, my life, which is his way of saying like, when you work here, like we're a family, like there's nothing to kind of separate that. And he was actually a really nice guy. I don't mean to pick on him as an individual, but I think that mentality really just kind of does seep in everywhere. I mean, not just in Silicon Valley, but kind of at every kind of major corporation, or in the case of a law firm, major LLC, LLP, whatever. And it's true. I mean, I remember like when I worked at the big law firm, it was kind of like socially pressured to wear kind of purple on like LGBT day or something like that. Right. I mean, there's all sorts of things where you're expected to act to conform with the company's corporate culture. I think it was Eric Erickson's Substack that he wrote about the Basecamp story. He was kind of just making some like very like traditional conservative points, which is that it is very conservative. And I think with those of us in kind of the conservative commentariat space should be really emphasizing that it is profoundly healthy as a matter of the human condition to not make your work your life. You should really be focusing on your family, on your church or synagogue, on your civic commitments, on the interdependent mutual bonds of citizenry that actually tie and cohere a nation state ultimately together. Things like that. All of that really in kind of the grand scheme of things is frankly more important than where you go to work. One kind of just additional thought I have about this kind of just this increasingly ubiquitous paradigm where like the work kind of is your life, though, is I wonder whether kind of the COVID era Zoom work from home revolution will actually, in a sense, actually exacerbate that. I think some people might think it's better because you're working from home, you're maybe surrounded by kids. I worry that it actually might make it worse because there's something about like physically going into the office and then literally physically leaving, the very act of physically leaving at like 5 or 6 p.m. or whenever your workday ends. Then you get home and you feel, liberated. So I actually wonder whether this kind of work from home mentality necessarily makes it so that your work is your home and that they cannot be separated. So I actually really worry about that. I feel like Rusty Reno, First Things, has actually made a very similar point as well.
I would make sort of a tangentially related point to that, which is one of the hallmarks of the left is that they make every single sphere of life political. And it shows that for them, they really are zealots for their progressive anti-religion. And so the notion of the business world being a neutral avenue simply is intolerable to the people who say that if you are neutral, you are in effect on the other side and you are a racist and a bigot and irredeemable, deplorable, and you must be purged from society. So on that basis alone, you have to applaud Basecamp for taking this position that they did. Obviously, there is perhaps the self-interested element of it as well, which is to Emily's point, and I would urge everyone to read Glenn Reynolds actually on education, because he talks about the fact that there's this unsustainable bubble because of all the billions of dollars that are being pushed into, equity, diversity, and inclusion administrators at schools, as opposed to bringing in the best professors and materials and the like. Maybe there is a market adjustment that's going to take place where wokeism is seen to be inefficient and actually ultimately to the detriment of these companies. At the end of the day, we'll see. Typically, markets do punish discrimination. And if there's ideological discrimination, it should punish it. We'll see how it ultimately plays out. But I think it's important to note that the idea that you have to kind of toe a party line inside your place of work is something that is literally what happens in China. The Chinese Communist Party embeds cells within putatively private companies there. I mean, nothing's really private if it's operating under the Chinese Communist Party's rule, but they actually have Communist Party cells in the company, and those cells increasingly literally make business decisions in the private companies, setting aside the state-backed enterprises and then the state-owned enterprises there as well. So you see the convergence once again with communist China here as we go through this continuing anti-cultural revolution. And we ought to hold up and allow everyone who fights against this, from a Basecamp to the politicians who are opposing racist anti-racism down in Texas, the people who are fighting critical race theory in our education system more broadly. And I think that, look, maybe we are seeing the limits to wokeism, that there is going to be a backlash. And if we can take one positive, it's that there are some entities and individuals who are standing up, taking a stand and saying enough is enough of this. And we ought to hold them up, because the more examples that we see, the more courage other people will have to stand with them.
Yeah, well, that's kind of a perfect segue, actually. I'm pushing back against the excesses of wokeism. I feel like the scourge of woke capital is something that pops up pretty much on every podcast episode we have. But it's worth talking about again, because there have been some newer developments. It just seems to me basically that the general trajectory of the tension between kind of the simmering, I would say, ascendant, kind of more nationalist populist elements of the conservative movement and the Republican Party, the tension between those elements and the Chamber of Commerce wing is just increasingly reaching an unsustainable fever pitch. And of course, there's kind of lots of questions here about how kind of a big tent party can sustain itself, frankly, whether it ought to sustain itself, right? There's a lot to unpack here in general, but specifically, I guess we're still kind of dealing. This is about a month now, just over a month, I guess, after kind of all the boycott started, after the Georgia election reform law, which frankly, in the grand scheme of things, was actually a very milquetoast election reform law, by the way. It frankly did not go far enough if you really want literal electoral integrity. But of course, Major League Baseball, as we've discussed on previous episodes, moved its All-Star game to here in Denver, Colorado, which is where I live. So I guess yay for me, but bad for baseball. There's been any number of kind of higher profile Fortune 500 companies that have doubled down on many pre-existing boycotts of Georgia. Georgia, of course, was kind of also targeted for, I think it was a 6-week abortion ban that they had a couple of years ago in 2019, if I recall. But anyway, some specific developments on this particular woke capital front that I think are worth flagging. Ted Cruz last week had a very fiery op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. I like others, perhaps on this podcast, I'm fortunate to know Ted fairly personally. We actually co-wrote a book on the Supreme Court together last year. And after, when Ted Cruz is coming out specifically doing this, it's a big deal because he is a very traditional kind of Reaganite conservative at his core. More specifically, after his incredibly successful stint as Texas Solicitor General, he was a partner at Morgan Lewis, a white shoe law firm, where he largely defended kind of corporate clients going up to the Supreme Court. So for him to do this is kind of a big deal. And specifically in this op-ed entitled, quote, "Your woke money is no good here," Senator Cruz says, "In my 9 years in the Senate, I've received $2.6 million in contributions from corporate political action committees. Starting today, I no longer accept money from any corporate PAC. I urge my GOP colleagues at all levels to do the same." Big deal. Now, what makes it even bigger deal is that it more or less directly followed on probably an even more abrasive and assertive op-ed that Marco Rubio had written in the New York Post. Listen to this rhetoric. Senator Rubio says, quote, "No policymaker would allow a company to dump toxic waste into a river upstream of a thriving town he is charged with governing. Yet corporate America eagerly dumps woke, toxic nonsense into our culture, and it's only gotten more destructive with time." At the same time, Senator Hawley, who was kind of made woke capital and big tech and the intersection thereof, kind of like his main targets ever since he got to the Senate, His latest piece of legislation, which is the Trust Busting for the 21st Century Act, places in its crosshairs not just big tech, but kind of woke big capital and big business, frankly, just in general. It's kind of a hard ban on mergers over a certain size, really kind of placing the Fortune 500, the biggest of all Chamber of Commerce-esque companies, directly in its crosshairs. And then of course, on the big tech issue specifically, there's Ken Buck over on the House side, who has come out to lead a campaign to kind of get his Republican colleagues to forswear all political donations from Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, and Twitter. So there's just a lot going on right now. There's like a lot of kind of high profile Republicans who are really kind of pushing back very hard. You're certainly seeing some of this at the state level as well. I think that's only going to continue. Folks like Ron DeSantis, Greg Abbott, I think you're only going to see more of that at kind of the gubernatorial level as well. We talked about this on previous podcasts. It seems obvious to me at a very, very, very bare minimum, Republicans ought to stop mollycoddling these companies. They ought to stop giving out ridiculous corporate welfare and cronyism and things like that. Of course, the bigger question then is, whether you do want to go, full David Azrat, so to speak, and go to my favorite talking point of, rewarding your friends and punishing your enemies. We kind of debate this on almost every podcast, it seems like, but at this point, I'm happy to I'll toss it to the panel. It just seems to me that kind of this tension between kind of woke capital and the GOP's Chamber of Commerce wing the tension has never been more unsustainable. I'm genuinely not sure how this resolves itself, but welcome any thoughts on that, obviously.
So I think that you are correct. The tension, I think, is somewhat unprecedented. But I think for the Republican Party, follow through is always the issue. And how much of this is chest thumping versus, an actual metric of future action. And, keep in mind, we're only, 4 years removed from the Republican Party with full control of the government. And the first thing we did was massive corporate tax cuts. And all those members of Congress are still there, and I think are hesitant to walk that back. We're a party that I think for a long time has genuflected in the face of, corporate carve-outs and free trade deals, massive corporate tax cuts, deregulation is our central, normative priority. And all those things, I think have merit in public policy debates. But from where I sit, I think that the Republican Party really needs to focus on, become a party that, doesn't grow government necessarily to punish people, but takes the government that exists and reprioritizes its aims, away from this excessive deference toward corporate culture, toward, corporate profits, and toward, a small business, family first party that really focuses on the civil society, and corporations can do a lot of damage to that civil society. So I think, I welcome all these attempts. I think the Republican Party is more actively iterating on this point than at any point I've ever seen. I've worked in 15 years in Republican politics. I've never seen, such dynamism on this point. But I do think they're going to have to see it through in a way that I think may actually rely on a younger generation of politicians, because this current one, I think, is so entrenched in how the party's done business that it's going to be incumbent, I think, upon a new class of electeds or the younger group that can pivot to the reality that we're living in, which is in many sectors of the economy, it's almost a plutocracy, and so I think it's incumbent upon the Congress to figure out how to act in that regard.
Yeah, this is like really the big thread running through our politics right now on the right, or our conversation, every conversation we have on the right. I mean, it's super interesting because in the last segment, we talked about stakeholder capitalism, and there's almost a conservative argument being made here for stakeholder capitalism. It sort of reminds me of, well, a different form of stakeholder capitalism, but it's in the same vein. And it reminds me of what J.D. Vance told Tucker Carlson when Tucker Carlson sort of did the devil's advocate argument to him about, Google is a private company. Should the government be stepping in, blah, blah, blah. And J.D. Vance said, my answer to that is, I don't care. No, I don't agree with that argument, but I do think it's injecting a very interesting anti-establishment economics into the Republican Party that kind of needs to be there. And my question is, let's make sure that we're like threading the needle between saying we don't think corporate tax cuts, it's not that corporate tax cuts are bad, it's that we had all of the power of government, and we had all of these cultural priorities that needed to get done, that conservatives should be doing. And what did we do? We reflexively spent all of this time, all of this capital, all of our resources on corporate tax cuts. Do I think the corporate tax cuts helped the middle class? Yes. Do I think they've helped us with jobs? Absolutely, yes. Do I think that there were far more important things that conservative legislators should have spent their time on, and a conservative president should have spent their time on? Yeah, absolutely. And so to me, it's just striking that balance between reprioritizing without also negating or losing touch with like the fact that freedom in the market can be a beautiful thing, that can be something that lifts people out of poverty and lifts people out of the middle class into the upper middle class, or into the upper middle, or into the upper class. And like there's part of that is sort of inextricably intertwined with the American dream, without being sort of reflexive Koch brothers like asinine free market fundamentalism. So there's a balance that needs to be struck. And, frankly, if the Republican Party starts erring on the J.D. Vance side, that doesn't bother me as much as erring on the free market fundamentalist side.
Yeah, so I think beyond reprioritization, part of threading the needle, I would say, is we should judge our politicians by a simple question, which is, do you as a leader, as a representative of this country, believe that you should be lavishing privileges de facto or de jure on entities that aim in effect to overthrow your regime? And a related question to that is, okay, we all care about tax policy. We all understand that taxes destroy capital, they disincentivize people, they have all sorts of other knock-on effects that are horrible. But what does the tax rate matter if you've lost your country at the end of the day? And I think those are the standards that we have to judge our politicians by. And so there's an element of a negative policy agenda, which is, how do you roll back the effort of woke capital to essentially erode the values and principles that we hold dear? And of course, you can do things with the tax code and subsidies and all sorts of other areas as well to get the cronyism out of the system. But then the other aspect is, what does the positive agenda look like? And I think that is a question that is an open question. And it goes to Emily's point, which is balancing both the sort of economic rationales for certain policies with the fact that obviously the government shouldn't exist to help benefit people who are ultimately averse to the system from which that government arose. And I think those are questions that we'll have to grapple with over time on this show. But the starting point should be, essentially, if you're helping adversaries of your system, stop helping them and roll it back to create an actual neutral level playing field. And then we can talk about actually what the affirmative policies ought to be.
Speaking of leveling the playing field, we're transitioning to an effort in Virginia, which is not exactly the same concept of leveling the playing field. But what happened in the state of Virginia is that something on the Department of Education's website indicated, in just sort of vague and confusing terms, that there would be a process of distancing the education system in Virginia away from accelerated math classes until 11th grade. And it did cite equity as one of the reasons, or one of the pursuits of this kind of new process and new system. Now, the department, as recently as this week, has walked away from that. And the state has tried to walk away from that and has tried to say, listen, this is actually, all the kids are still going to be able to take accelerated math classes if their teachers deem that they should be taking accelerated math classes. And, this is about rejiggering the program and making sure everybody is ready for the 21st century and the job market, et cetera, et cetera. So whatever happens in Virginia, we'll see. We know that they did originally cite, in vague terms, equity, but it reminded me, as I was thinking about this, I went to a public school in Wisconsin, obviously, more than 10 years ago now. And what they were doing was basically trying to create a system that lumped more people into the middle and took more people out of those upper echelons in the name of taking people out of the bottom echelons, right? So like, we will level everybody with our grading system, so that we take people out of the bottom, not on their merits, but just with the label, to sort of help cushion the blow of failure. And but that will also, of course, drag people down from the top echelons. And so I don't think this is, totally isolated. I guess it's being discussed in the context of critical race theory right now. And Ian Pryor has weighed in on this. He's from Loudoun County and he works on these issues and he's connected it to critical race theory. I think it goes back even further. I mean, I think this goes to a broader effort to sort of treat children as though to basically dull the pain of competition, which also dulls the joy of competition. And I don't mean competition in an economic sense, but I mean competition in a personal sense. So dull the pain of competition, but also to dull the joy in order to keep children from feeling poorly about themselves, which I think also keeps them from achieving as much as they could. And so I do think there's a critical theory angle here. I also think there's a deeper parenting and, sort of the worldview that we're imparting on the youth angle here as well. I'm curious what you guys think. We know that Generation Z is the most risk-averse generation, basically in recent memory, as this has been studied in recent memory. And I wonder if you think that efforts like this will further condition younger generations, even younger than Generation Z, to see the world in this harmful way.
Well, let me jump in with a couple points. First, this sort of follows a theme that we've been discussing of politics over merit, and I think the critical race theory aspect. It's really important to emphasize just how pernicious and insidious the focus on equity is over equality. Particularly, you're talking about math of all subjects, and STEM itself has already been corrupted. We've seen scientism become a religion of its own, particularly over the last year. So once again, every field, including the fields that can't be corrupted, have been corrupted by politics. I think your point's absolutely right, Emily, that this is going to have a terrible, detrimental effect on people who could excel and could be in vastly more sophisticated classes. But I think if you go back, I mentioned Glenn Reynolds before on education, and he's talked about this. We have sort of a 19th century model of public education in and of itself. Like, it doesn't even make sense when you think about it, setting aside, obviously, the socialization of kids and their ages, and it does matter that they're with people in their age cohorts. But you have to believe that there are some people at school who could excel were they in far more complex courses with people older than them, and other people who would benefit by being potentially with people younger than them, because skills and abilities should be actually what determines the pace at which you go and where you're placed. That's a whole other conversation that goes way beyond the scope of this. But I think the everyone gets a trophy, self-esteem focused culture has run so far amok, and it's going to create a generation of people who are severely underserved by all of these institutions. And then the last point I'll make is the cynical aspect of this is, what if kind of the great inflation for some and holding some people back, but benefiting others, and leaving aside the fact that we still enter a hyper competitive society where everyone is gunning for their position and their place in life. And you really set aside, even though politics does help people rise ultimately, particularly in a corporate setting, it's a hyper competitive world out there. So it does a disservice if you try to take away that competition and you don't let people fail and succeed, because those are essential to ultimately growing. What if this is actually sort of a cynical ploy by the elites to ensure that we have a mediocre class of individuals and the elites continue to perpetuate their positions as elites in our society? I would leave with that sort of cynical spin on this as well.
Well, I think that's a great point, though, because we never talk about how regressive all of these policies actually are. Because if you, dumb down any sort of public school acceptance or curriculum or accessibility to advanced classes, the people who can get out, the parents with means, will remove their children. Because to your point, they're not blind to the fact that this is a hyper-competitive world we're living in. We're living in a globalized society, right? Where American kids have to compete with Chinese mathletes, And if they're not accessing those courses, parents with means will pull their kids out of those schools and put them in places that can give them those abilities. Parents without means will not be able to do that, and their kids will suffer. You'll have smart kids sitting in class, unable to, access advanced education. That serves no one. The point of public education in America is it's the great equalizer, right? The point is anyone with skills, regardless of means, can access, some of the best educational curriculums in the world and succeed on the merits. That's a fundamentally American concept of, equality of opportunity, and we're taking it away to serve some sort of virtue signaling end, some end of diversity that I think completely misses the point about what public education is supposed to do, which is to equalize, across, means and across race and across gender. So this is really detrimental, I think, not only to our public education system, but sort of how we view ourselves as Americans generally.
Yeah, we talked in the first segment about, how Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin have to be just licking their chops at what is going on in the CIA or the United States Navy or any of these other kind of institutions of the military intelligence complex, if you will. Well, they are similarly licking their chops over stories like this. Okay, we are willfully making ourselves stupid. We are dumbing ourselves down for no reason whatsoever other than smug, white, effete liberal elites' own self-satisfaction. That is literally what we're doing here. We are undermining, throwing under the bus America's standing on the world stage. And I'm not talking about here like hard military assets, aircraft carriers or anything like that, but our standing on the world stage insofar as America was a place where science and math and technology actually made substantial advances. We're the country that famously, as every politician imaginable loves to say, put a man on the moon. We are the country that has made substantial advances, more than any other country in the world in the fields of science and math. The other point to make here, which Ben emphasizes, is just the incredibly pernicious, at a minimum, at the maximum, outright racist notion that we need quote unquote equitable outcomes in lieu of equality itself. If I can do a quick plug, I co-host another podcast as well for Newsweek, my main employer. And on our latest episode of the podcast, we have Max Eden, formerly Manhattan student now of AEI, debating with a gentleman by the name of Marcus Johnson whether the states should ban critical race theory. And in this podcast, I asked Marcus, I said, aren't the Ibram X. Kendis of the world, the people who are making just the quote unquote equity, the people who are making that the focal point, the end all be all of what a just politics can be, aren't they just completely undermining over a century of civil rights leaders from Frederick Douglass through Martin Luther King itself? So it seems to me similarly here that when you were saying that, this is necessary for equity, for purposely dumbing down standards, how is that not racist? I mean, that has to be racist, right? I mean, this is basically something, this is kind of a point that Clarence Thomas has made over and over again in his 25, 30 years of jurisprudence on kind of race conscious admissions policies, affirmative action, all that stuff. And he always says, that quote unquote benign racism is still racism. So if you are trying to get to equity by means of trying to ensure equitable outcomes by effectively, what that is saying is that certain segments of the population cannot match other segments of the population. That is racist. That is discriminatory. So it's just it's very bad. What's happening in the schools obviously has been a nightmare for at least 60, 70 years, going back to the terrible Supreme Court cases of the late 1940s, early 1950s with respect to kind of school prayer and the Bible in the schools and all of that. So it's just been we have gone from kind of a virtuous kind of civics education curriculum focused around God and the Bible to purposely dumbing down math to appease the Chinese Communist Party and make white Upper West Side New York Times op-ed page reading liberals happy. It is a very, very, very slippery slope that we're on right now. But on that a very dour note, we're probably towards the end of this segment. Wonder if anyone has any kind of final thoughts for the episode.
Well, I have final thoughts on the segment just quickly, basically that, it's true. This does please a very small, slim proportion of the population. And it used to, they don't care that it's racist. They know that it's racist. They just have a totally different definition of what is actually racism that is stupid and incoherent, but it's what they want to force into the mainstream of the country and are successfully doing. So my final thought in general, and I'll throw it around the room from that more narrow point, is that it's just, I'm thinking about this a lot recently. Are we living through the adjustment period? Are we living through the growing pains? And as things like what happened at Basecamp happen elsewhere, will we have a Google that doesn't fire James Damore at some point as this obvious mentality that this is a workplace where we needn't, you can be decent to each other, you can have different politics, but we can't say that everybody who isn't actively involved in anti-racism is a racist at a software company. We have to make software. You're being paid to make software. If the sort of like obvious, if we can return to that and re-normalize normal, things could be back on track. But that's a heavy lift because there's still the sort of the binary formulation that you're a progressive or you're a bigot that's in play everywhere. And until that can sort of be purged from the ranks of power in this country, classrooms, newsrooms, writers' room, C-suites, boardrooms, all of those places, good luck to us. And, we're still filtering tons of students through higher education, which imparts that conditioning. So I don't know if the tide can be turned, but there is something to be said for the obvious making a resurgence. As millennials age, they can say, we are exhausted. Free marketeers can say, we need to make money. And so it's possible that logic will prevail.
I'm like somewhat similarly hopeful. I think, it's interesting, the progressive white liberals that Josh sort of artfully mentioned, I think have this like death grip, on the institutions and on sort of forcing this, ideology down the throats of everyone. And, I'm wondering if increasingly people are just waking up to the fact they're not listening anymore. People sort of know that the New York Times has been captured by this ideology, and they're playing toward a subscriber base. I'm reminded of a school board election in Texas this week where, school board members who ran against critical race theory in school absolutely trounced the members who were running for it, like 70-30 or something like that. And then everything that's happening at Basecamp sort of reflecting, again, the sort of existential exhaustion that the rest of the world has, with this ideology that is all consuming, to the point that Josh made earlier about the blending of the political and the personal. It is exhausting. You see the New York Times writers performatively being like, I'm so exhausted after covering the Trump years. Well, people are exhausted of being sucked into their vortex of just like complete political drama, nonstop, and being told how horrible everyone is and being punished for things that you don't even understand. So I do think maybe the pendulum can swing, although it's still unclear to me if it fully will, and if in the process it will continue to take heads off as it does. And that's what I really think people have to stand up and stand up against, because to the point Emily made, we are actually still training a bunch of woke soldiers at the university. So I think the more likely outcome is that we still continue to create these almost two separate cultures in America, one that is performatively woke and one that is just not listening anymore. And I don't know if that's even a helpful development, but that's what I see on the horizon.
I guess I'll go for it, Ben.
No, go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, so I was going to take, Rachel mentioned what I was saying earlier about kind of the professional personal divide and take it in a slightly different direction. There was a really good interview that ran this past weekend. I guess it was Sunday night, Monday morning. The Public Discourse website had a really kind of lengthy interview with Yuval Levin about his most recent book. And he has really kind of scathing words for the social media companies, which I, of course, was heartened to see as well. And he makes this difference between communion and communication. Communion, of course, Yuval is Jewish. He's not necessarily talking about communion in kind of a Catholic sense. He's talking about just like lowercase c communion in kind of a societal sense. Communion entails kind of human flesh, person-to-person interaction. Communication, by contrast, is a much kind of lower on the totem pole word that by definition can mean anything. It can mean a text message. It can mean an email. And Yuval's point is we need more communion and less communication. The issue is, and I'm hardly the first person to make this observation, is that I think one of the longer lasting effects of the COVID Zoom work from home thing is that we are only going to get less and less communion and more communication. More and more institutions have had to kind of fight to kind of optimize and fight to get to stay alive, to kind of get their bottom lines in something closely approximating decent shape by getting towards a communication, not a communion paradigm. They've had to kind of adapt to kind of this Zoom webinar system. Higher ed, churches, synagogues, all of them, right? All these institutions have been forced to adapt. And I really, really, really worry about that. There's not going to be like an on-off switch. It's not like we're going to reach herd immunity. It's not like we're going to reach 70, 80% whatever vaccination. People are going to be like, okay, now it's time to kind of fully re-enter the human-to-human interaction. Well, no, it's obviously not going to work like that. And I wonder if there's a role for the state here in kind of putting its thumb on the scale to try to like incentivize or just encourage. If there's some role for public policy once we kind of reach an even higher vaccination level and get closer to herd immunity to get us closer to communion and away from communication. I haven't really thought that out in full yet. Just kind of putting an idea out there.
I want to respond again to that last segment and the broader point about anti-racism, just because it's worth hammering every single time it comes up. By their own standards, anti-racisms judge policies on the basis of whether they lead to equity or not, which is to say that the outcomes in society perfectly reflect the percentages of the races that exist across society, perfectly reflect the demographic picture. Well, anti-racists all support racist policies because every single city in this country pretty much has been Democrat-led for about 60 years, embraced all the policies that the anti-racists claim to care about, including, for example, going after the police forces, supporting teachers' unions policies. And this is, of course, reflected, by the way, in kids being held out of schools, which has disproportionately hurt, of course, those living in urban areas, and also in their anti-capitalist policy support as well. So in every instance, the anti-racists prove themselves to be racist by their own definitions, leaving aside the ideology behind it, which of course embraces discrimination and bigotry. Okay, setting that point aside, I wrote an article this week in the Epoch Times where I wrote that America courts disaster by rewarding failure. And I profile a few people in government, in media, and academia who have failed upwards to the highest ranks of our society and pose the sort of rhetorical question, what does it mean when the people who get promoted to the highest positions in all of these elite areas are failures on the merits? Or looked at another way, what happens when we promote and prioritize people and reward people on the basis of things other than merit? And I think that goes to kind of the heart of a lot of what we've been talking about today, which is that a society that not only rewards politics, but actually rewards failure on the merit, as opposed to cultivating excellence, is not going to be long for this world. And maybe what we're seeing is that as we see the effects of wokism have its depredations and show the pains that it inflicts on society, maybe human nature is finally starting to kick in and we're seeing a counter response to it among the American people. We'll see how it ultimately plays out. But I just end on the fact that we need to cultivate excellence and virtue and not celebrate failure and politics if we ultimately want to survive and thrive as this peaceful and prosperous nation that we've been so lucky to grow up in is to continue.
Well, there's your silver lining, everyone. On behalf of Ben, Rachel, Josh, and myself, thanks for tuning in. I'm Emily Jashinsky. See you at the next NatCon Squad.